Hey, how's it going everyone? I'm White Pointer, and in a previous video I explored the various graphical capabilities of the Sega Mega Drive, or Genesis, but I only covered the base system. Well, since I've covered ways Nintendo boosted the capabilities of their console, I decided it was time to explore how Sega did it, as they took a mostly different approach. Before I go further though, I want to acknowledge that there are gamers out there that consider the Mega CD, and especially the 32X, as their own consoles, rather than enhancements for the Mega Drive. I understand this reasoning, but for the purposes of the video, I'm considering them as add-ons, because that's exactly how Sega saw them back in the day. They were both developed for the purpose of extending the life of the Mega Drive until the Saturn launched, and neither worked without the base console. So with that out of the way, before we get to how Sega did what Nintendo didn't, let's take a look at how Sega did what Nintendo did. When the Super FX and games that used it started to hit the market, Sega was really worried that it made the Mega Drive look inferior by comparison, so they got to work on their own version as a direct response. Called the Sega Virtual Processor, or SVP, this was a coprocessor that, like Nintendo's approach, was contained within the cartridge. As with the Super FX, its primary intended purpose was to allow the console to render full 3D polygonal games. Because the Mega Drive was also a tile-based console, it worked quite similarly to the Super FX as well. It would render polygons into a frame buffer contained on the cartridge, convert them to tiles, and copy them across to the main VRAM via DMA. It actually did a pretty good job of it too, running noticeably faster than even the Super FX2, not only due to the faster CPU of the base console, but also because the chip itself was clocked a bit faster. Only one game was ever produced to use the SVP chip however, and that was Virtua Racing. It retailed for $100 equivalent to about $212 now in 2024, which made it the most expensive Sega cartridge ever sold at the time. There were plans to bring Virtua Fighter and Daytona USA to the system that would utilise the chip as well, but those plans were scrapped in favour of moving those games to the Saturn instead. The Mega Drive did receive an unusual port of Virtua Fighter 2, but it was 2D and didn't utilise the SVP chip. To reduce the cost of future games that use the SVP chip, Sega had plans to produce a special add-on module that contained the SVP chip inside it, that the player would only need to buy once. This would have been inserted into the Mega Drive's cartridge slot, and then a supported game plugged into the top of it. If that sounds a lot like how the 32X worked to you, you'd be right, and the idea of the SVP add-on was cancelled, likely because the 32X itself was right around the corner. So that segues nicely into the main method Sega used to enhance the Mega Drive's capabilities, and that was using add-ons. And we'll start with the somewhat infamous 32X. I say infamous because while the tech behind it was pretty impressive for the time, it was a commercial failure for Sega, with only around 40 games released for it. So what exactly did it even do, and how did it operate in conjunction with the base unit? I figured this might be of interest to some of you because there is surprisingly little information about it out there. So let's start with the stuff everybody knows first. The 32X was an expansion that plugged into the cartridge port of the Mega Drive.
Just stick it in your Genesis.
The video out from the base unit was attached to the 32X, then another video cable ran from the 32X to the TV, effectively making the 32X the new video output device. It also needed its own power adapter. And yeah, if you combine that with the Mega CD, which also required its own power adapter, you could end up with a very messy looking setup. As far as the actual hardware was concerned, as its name suggests, it was indeed a 32-bit system. It wasn't one of those cases where it claimed to be something it wasn't. It contained two Hitachi SH2 32-bit processors, clocked at roughly 23 MHz each, give or take a little depending on whether you're talking about NTSC or PAL. Interestingly enough, these would be the same 32-bit processors that powered the Saturn as well, albeit clocked slower than what the Saturn got. In this sense, it was kind of a scaled down Saturn. It added an extra 512 kilobytes of RAM, split 50-50 between the main RAM and the VRAM. The VRAM itself was further split in half again into two frame buffers. Keep this in mind because I'll be coming back to it later to explain why this was the case. It had its own VDP or video display processor, which had a total color palette matching the Super Nintendo at 32,768. It was capable of producing 3D polygon graphics with texture mapping and GURAD shading, sprite scaling, rotation, and alpha blending. Although it should be noted that the hardware itself didn't provide support for this stuff, so it all needed to be written in software. It also had its own sound chip to provide an extra 2 channels, plus surround sound capability. The 32X VDP had 3 different graphics modes: Packed Pixel, Run Length, and Direct Color. Packed Pixel was the most common mode, and provided 256 on-screen colors at 8 bits per pixel, and could output at the base unit's standard resolution of 320 by 224, or even a little bigger than that at 320 by 240. Run Length worked a bit differently. Instead of plotting individual pixels, it plotted lines of pixels at once, called a run, with the developer being able to specify the number of pixels in a run. It could do 256 on-screen colors at 16 bits per run. Both of these modes used indexed color palettes and could use color lookup tables. The final mode, Direct Color, actually provided the capability of displaying all 32,768 colors on screen at once at 16 bits per pixel, at the cost of reducing the screen resolution to 320 by 204. This mode didn't use a color palette and instead specified colors as raw values. Alright, so what does all that actually mean in practice? If you remember from my video about graphical tricks on the Mega Drive, the console had 2 background planes plus a sprite plane. What the 32X effectively did was introduce an additional plane. The base unit would send its video signal to the 32X, and the 32X would add its extra plane, which could be either on top of or behind the Mega Drive's video signal. However, the way it created that plane was quite different to the way the base console did it. You might remember from some previous videos I've made that the Mega Drive, like other consoles at the time, was tile-based and drew images to the screen one scanline at a time. However, this isn't how the 32X worked. What the 32X did was more like how the Saturn would work. It used those 2 frame buffers I mentioned earlier, which the SH2 CPUs wrote to, but they could only write to one of them at a time. So the 32X would draw the contents of one frame buffer to the screen, while the other was written to by the CPUs, alternating every frame, and it created the frame to draw by basically plotting individual pixels on the screen. This allowed it to render polygons in real time, but because it was all done in software, it wasn't particularly fast at doing this, so most games that try to take advantage of this run at a pretty poor frame rate of 20 frames per second or even less. 2 games that did do a pretty good job of it though were Sega's own conversions of its arcade games Virtua Fighter and Virtua Racing Deluxe, with the latter being a noticeable improvement over the SVP powered version that we looked at earlier. Virtua Fighter was actually a pretty impressive port all things considered, maintaining a solid frame rate and playing very well, arguably better than the Saturn version that released before it. There were a number of games that attempted full 3D, with results varying from pretty good in the case of something like Shadow Squadron, also known as Stellar Assault, to kind of mediocre like Metalhead. In most cases, the Mega Drive was used to show a scrolling 2D background behind the 3D polygons, or in some cases to display a cockpit or some other element on top of them. The majority of the add-ons 34 games then, if you don't count the Mega CD games that also required it, concentrated on 2D. But due to how its dual frame buffer pixel plotting architecture worked, it also wasn't very good at drawing scrolling 2D bitmapped graphics either. So it was often the case that the base Mega Drive handled the scrolling backgrounds that these games required, while the 32X overlaid sprites on top of them in order to keep the frame rate reasonable. In doing so, this actually freed up the Mega Drive sprite plane to instead be often used as almost another background plane to create more detail. You can see this pretty clearly if you compare the 2 Sega versions of Mortal Kombat 2 side by side. In having the 32X handle the sprites, it was able to create some cool sprite scaling effects, such as what you can see in Knuckles Chaotix for example. But the sprite scaling was also taken to a different level with the ports of 2 of Sega's arcade superscaler games, those being Afterburner Complete and Space Harrier. Neither of these games actually ran at arcade speed, but they still looked good and played well, and were the best home ports of these games at the time regardless. Speaking of sprite scaling, let's move on to the Mega CD, or Sega CD as it was known in North America. This was the first add-on and plugged into the expansion slot on the side of the Mega Drive. This expansion slot, believe it or not, was actually a modified cartridge slot, so when the Mega CD was attached, the Mega Drive saw it as a cartridge. As the name implies, it enabled it to play games from the CD format, many of which utilised full motion video or FMV. It was more than just a simple CD drive, however. It had its own CPU, which was in fact the same Motorola 68000 that the Mega Drive had, but clocked quite a bit faster at 12.5 MHz. It had its own RAM, VRAM and audio RAM, and its own Super Nintendo-like sample-based sound processor that provided an extra 10 sound channels. Notably though, it contained an ASIC coprocessor that granted the ability to pull off some advanced graphical effects, such as scaling and rotation, of not just background tile maps, but sprites as well. However, it did not have its own VDP, or video display processor, which is why it needed to be hooked up to the Mega Drive in order to function. This meant that it was restricted to the same colour palette as the Mega Drive, which was a maximum of 64 colours on screen out of a possible 512. However, it was only a single speed drive, meaning loading times were generally quite slow. Like the 32X, it also needed its own power supply. Also like the 32X, there are a couple of different modes it could run in, but in this case they affected how the data was transferred from the Mega CD to the Mega Drive for display. These were called 1M and 2M. Now, the Mega Drive couldn't see the data on the disk of the Mega CD directly, it could only see the data that was currently in the Mega CD's VRAM, also sometimes called word RAM. It was therefore the job of the Mega CD to read the data off the disk, perform any required processing with its own fast CPU, and then copy it to its VRAM, so the Mega Drive could then read it like would read data off a cartridge, and use its own hardware to draw the image to the screen. The Mega CD had 256 kilobytes, or in other words 2 megabits of VRAM, which could be accessed by both the Mega CD and the Mega Drive itself. In 1M mode, which meant 1 megabit mode, this VRAM was split in half into two 128 kilobyte or 1 megabit banks, which allowed the Mega CD to write to one bank while the Mega Drive read from the other, before it swapped around every frame. In a sense working similar to how the 32X frame buffers function that we looked at earlier. This allowed it to transfer video data without the need to constantly stop and buffer, but with only 128 kilobytes of RAM to work with at the time, it meant the videos ran in a pretty low resolution, and the console's small colour palette didn't help matters, making the videos look even grainier. In 2M mode, which meant 2 megabit mode, the entire 256 kilobytes was available, but only one device could access it at a time. This was used if larger chunks of data needed to be transferred, albeit at a slower speed, for example loading in level data before the player started playing. What's actually pretty interesting is that because of the Mega CD's dependence on the Mega Drive's VDP to draw its graphics, and that the Mega Drive was a tile-based console, the FMVs were also actually made up of tiles, just like everything else was, and drawn to one of the console's background planes. We can see what the tiles look like for an FMV game in this example of Sewer Shark. It really was essentially just treated as a big cartridge as far as the Mega Drive was concerned. Full motion videos were also used as essentially an animated background in a number of games, with sprites overlaid over the top of them, such as Nova Storm. These kinds of games were actually pretty common on PC CD-ROM back in the day, but the Mega CD only had a small handful of them. There were also a few arcade laserdisc games that were ported across to the Mega CD, like Road Avenger, also known as Road Blaster. These generally were pretty decent for what they were, and sometimes played a little better than the arcade original, but of course didn't look quite as good. Still, they were the best console ports of these games you could get at the time. The Mega CD was more successful than the 32X, selling over 2 million units and having around 260 games released for it in total, roughly a quarter of the total number of games released on cartridge for the base Mega Drive. Although granted, many of them were just slightly enhanced ports of games already on the Mega Drive, such as Echo the Dolphin. These ports perhaps had new music, enhanced sound, added cinematics, or extra levels. There were some original games for it, such as Sonic CD, which is also a game that shows off the hardware scaling and rotation in the bonus stages. Soulstar is another game that was an original release for the platform that really leans heavily into these effects and showcased exactly what they could do. As I mentioned earlier, the Mega CD actually had a chip that was almost purely dedicated to performing these effects in hardware. Sega clearly felt like they were at a disadvantage against the Super Nintendo's Mode 7, so they made damn sure they added scaling and rotation capabilities to the Mega Drive as much as they could with these add-ons. One more game that's a pretty good example of this is the Mega CD version of Batman Returns. The majority of the rest of the catalogue mostly consisted of some nice looking 2D games such as Potful Mail, but nothing that really pushed the hardware to the point where it looked like the Mega Drive couldn't have handled them by itself, aside from the soundtracks and voice acting. So it's a bit disappointing that the hardware wasn't really utilised as well as it could have been. So the only question that needs answering then is what the heck the half a dozen games that needed both the 32X and the Mega CD were doing. Well, all of these games were FMV games that were already available for the Mega CD, such as Supreme Warrior shown here. Instead of rendering the video with the Mega Drive's VDP and using one of its background planes, it rendered the video with the 32X's extra plane. All this did in practical terms was increase the number of colours that the FMVs could use, making them look slightly less like vomit, but nothing more than that.
Magnify that death spear. Why is it still blurry?
That's all the resolution we have. Making it bigger doesn't make it clearer.
It does on CSI Miami.
So hopefully that now gives you a good idea of how the SVP, 32X and Mega CD worked, and how they enhanced the capabilities of the Mega Drive. In the end, this strategy that Sega went with wasn't all that successful, and in actual fact was unfortunately the beginning of their downfall. Between the SVP, the 32X, the Mega CD and the botched launch of the Saturn, Sega started confusing gamers with all of these different options that seemed like they did very similar things, and started losing the goodwill and trust they had built for so many years. What's your favourite 32X or Mega CD game? Drop a comment below and let me know. Give me a thumbs up if you like this video, it really helps a lot as these videos take a long time to put together, and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with my content. Thanks for watching and see you next time.